It was these people who were making do with very little that President John F. Kennedy came across in campaigning for office in the Appalachian region. As a result, his concerns about the region generated several outreach programs in states like Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And with the passage of several bills in the mid-1960s, America's war on poverty became official. In Appalachia, new roads were constructed to provide better access for residents and new industries. Water systems and new schools were built. And as America waged war on poverty, Appalachia found itself under siege. Cecil Bradfield, a native of the mountain hamlet of Arkansas, West Virginia, left his home to attend college in Ohio, but recalls that period of outreach that lays like a double-edged sword in Appalachia's history.
I returned to West Virginia as a rural pastor in 1965, just as the war on poverty was getting in full swing. And actually, some of the time I worked with VISTA volunteers who were coming in large numbers in the area where I was working in West Virginia near Franklin. If we look back on the war on poverty, it was based on a model, a deficiency model of people. That the reason that you are experiencing poverty and deprivation is because you're deficient in other ways. You're deficient in education. You're deficient in awareness of the rest of the world and some of those things. So I think in some respects that had a negative impact on the self-esteem of people who were living in Appalachia. I would receive calls from some of my colleagues, say in suburban D.C., and these are church colleagues, pastors, and they would say something like, "We'd like to bring some of our young people up to see poor people." They were seeing the national publicity, the documentaries on Appalachia, and isn't it terrible that these people 125, 140, 50 miles from us are living in these conditions? And so there was something about that didn't really strike me right. You know, here I am, I'm an Appalachian, I'm working in Appalachia, and here are people from an area considered to be very wealthy, and they're saying, could we bring some of our kids to see poor people? And what they didn't say is, you poor people.
These negative stereotypes did not reflect the Appalachia that Cecil grew up in and remembers fondly. And like many of the Appalachians we met in producing this program, he was eager to set the record straight about what life in Appalachia was and is really like.
Arkansas is a hollow. It has one road in, one road out, and at the center of the community there is a church and a school, a one-room school that I attended for 3 years. Growing up there, we never thought of ourselves as being deprived in any way, and really focused on some of the positive aspects of family and being in a community. There was not a sense of deprivation or poverty. We had enough.
I grew up in North Carolina in the mountains in the western part of the state, and of course at that time I was born in 1928, and so I was an infant when the Great Depression came, and we lived on a farm. We were subsistence farmers, and I don't think we noticed the Depression as much as a lot of people because we grew food and had our own, milk cows and chickens and eggs and that sort of thing. And so, but it was a rather sparse existence in a way. And as a lot of people have said, we were poor, but we didn't know it at the time.
Phyllis Street had a similar upbringing. She was raised in a small community in the mountains of southwest Virginia.
So many places were remote. In fact, where I grew up, because of the Depression and then the start of World War II, in the little community where I was raised, we didn't have electricity until 1949.
Times were really hard here on the mountain. There was no public works. Most of the way that people made a living was through gardening, farming, and they were self-sufficient, just like we were when we were at home. We raised practically everything we ate.
When I was growing up, there was a lot of small farms in the area, tobacco farms. Coal mining was the big industry. Even when I graduated from high school in the late 70s, coal was king. Guys that I went to high school with, after they finished high school, they'd get a job driving a coal truck or whatever, and make more than someone who went on to, who just graduated from college.
Coal mining was difficult and dangerous work. Making a living in these mountain communities was not an easy task. Life in Appalachia has created a culture of hard-working, self-sufficient, and inventive people. For generations, virtually everything had to be grown or handmade. Foods, clothing, tools, even medicines and cures had to be created in the imagination when the nearest hospital or doctor was miles and miles away.
My wife and I both make a point of telling the grandson stories about growing up in West Virginia and some of the remedies for certain conditions. Now, they both have, our grandsons have ear infections, and so they go to the pediatrician to get amoxicillin or something for those ear infections, and it kind of cracks them up a little bit when we tell them that both for me, my mother had a corncob pipe, and when we had earaches, we didn't call it an ear infection, we had earaches, she would blow smoke in our ears, and you will talk to a lot of people my age and older who had that same remedy. And we got over the ear infection or the earache or whatever it was.
Some of the herb cures that have come down to us seem really funny now, like smoking green mullein leaves if you have an irritated throat. Why would you smoke something if you have an irritation in your throat? But modern science has shown that there's something in the mullein leaves that actually does soothe an irritated throat if you smoke it.
The early self-sufficiency of the mountain people has led to a unique Appalachian heritage. Items that were once made out of necessity have now become art forms.
One of the best things that I can remember growing up was Mother she sewed our clothes a lot. She made a lot of our clothes. And any scraps that she had left over, she would work into a quilt. And it wasn't necessarily a piece of art, it was just a functional quilt. But I remember, like laying on the bed or in the bed at night and going through those, the squares on her quilt and thinking, oh, this was this and this was that and this was something else, because it was just bits and pieces of cloth that, she had saved back from our, clothes and that type of thing. The older I get, the more I appreciate that someday I won't have my mother. I can touch these things that she made, and maybe that that'll keep me closer to her. That's made me realize a lot of things.
Jeannie says that one of the things she realized was the importance of preserving her heritage. After graduating from East Tennessee State University, she returned home to Southwest Virginia and began working for PACE, Purely Appalachian Crafts Empowerment. She now spends her days educating people about Appalachian heritage and marketing the beautiful artwork that comes out of the region, and not just in Virginia. She recently accompanied Appalachian craftsmen and their work to London for an exhibition. It was during this project that she met Phyllis Street, a coal miner's widow who had learned quilting from her mother at a very young age.
One thing that I really, really enjoyed whenever I was smaller was when Mother would get her bag of scraps out in the wintertime to make quilts, and I would play with those. In fact, Mama has said that I think you were born with a needle in your hand. And Mama made quilts for us to sleep under with what was available. Of course, at that time, feed for the cattle and hogs and so forth, chickens, usually came in printed sacks, and of course those were used for everything, clothing and whatever, and scraps of those was used for piecing quilts. And because I just used whatever that Mama was not using, and I just picked up whatever colors and put together. But it was mine. It was something I had created, and to me it was special.
Phyllis used to be a professional dressmaker and ran her own fabric shop, but she says that quilting, which had been a part of her family for generations, was a part of her that just had to come out. She began making quilts for family members and eventually decided to make quilts for sale.
Doing a quilt is kind of compared to having a child. that it's hard to turn loose of one. When I sell a piece, then I know if someone is willing to pay the price for my quilt, then it's going to be taken care of. And they're going to appreciate it. In fact, the first one I sold was I traded it to my gynecologist. He did hysterectomy for me, and I swapped the quilt